The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with a single gunshot in a crowded street in Sarajevo. They called it the War to End All Wars, a title born of hope, or perhaps a desperate naivety. In the summer of 1914, the great powers of Europe were bound together by a web of secret treaties and ancient grudges. When the Archduke fell, the web tightened. Within weeks, the continent was in flames. Millions of young men, boys, really, marched off to the sound of brass bands and cheering crowds. They were told they'd be home before the leaves fell from the trees. The leaves fell, then the snow, then the years. By 1915, the war had changed. The grand maneuvers of the past were dead, buried under the mud of northern France and Belgium. Imagine a scar, a line of jagged earth stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. This was the Western Front. Between the trenches lay no man's land, a nightmare landscape of cratered soil, tangled barbed wire, and the skeletal remains of forests. Life in the trenches wasn't just about the enemy. It was about the cold that bit through wool coats. It was about the rats that grew fat on the waste of war. It was the 1,000-yard stare, the look of a man whose soul had already left the battlefield, even if his body remained. This was the first truly industrial war. For the first time, humanity's genius for invention was turned entirely toward the art of slaughter. The machine gun turned the heroic charge into a suicide mission. Then came the Yellow Cross, mustard gas. It didn't just kill, it lingered in the hollows of the earth, waiting for a misplaced mask. Above the mud, the knights of the sky fought in wood and canvas plains, their lives measured in weeks. Below them, for the first time, steel beasts called tanks began to crawl across the trenches, crushing everything in their path. The scale of the carnage was incomprehensible. At the Somme, 60,000 British soldiers fell in a single day. At Verdun, the hills themselves were reshaped by the weight of 10 million artillery shells. By 1917, the world was exhausted. Russia collapsed into revolution, withdrawing from the fight. But as one giant fell, another awoke. The United States, long hesitant, began pouring fresh blood and limitless resources into the Western Front. The German Spring Offensive of 1918 was their final, desperate roll of the dice. They broke the lines, they saw the lights of Paris, but they ran out of breath. The 100 Days Offensive began. The German army, starved by naval blockades and broken by the sheer weight of Allied reinforcements, finally began to buckle. The end came not with a surrender in the field, but an armistice in a railway carriage. On the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, the guns went silent. Men who had spent years trying to kill one another climbed out of their holes and looked across the wire. There was no cheering, just a heavy, hollow silence. 9 million soldiers died. 7 million civilians perished. Empires that had stood for centuries, the Romanovs, the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, were wiped off the map. We promised ourselves we would never let it happen again. We carved the names of the fallen into stone in every village and every city. We wore poppies to remember the blood spilled in Flanders fields. But the peace was fragile. The ink on the Treaty of Versailles was barely dry before the seeds of an even greater darkness began to take root in the ruins of the old world. The The Great War didn't end all wars. It simply taught us how much we were willing to lose.